Because ultimately, people are physiologically changing post-infection. So we have to test that and see what is going on. It's not a one size fits all. Not all men have low T post-infection. Not all women have fertility issues post-COVID infection, but we're seeing a huge correlation between these things. All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Jacque Show. So I'm here today in my casual dress down. It was kind of my day off, but not really. Got to meet with some phenomenal patients, and I've been doing a lot more research on this particular topic. And you can probably tell by the title of this that I'm probably going to get shadow banned. I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this stuff, but I'm not trying to speak ill of the virus. I'm trying to just allow us to understand what type of impact this virus did have on our hormones. Now, for those of you who know or who work with me or have heard any of the podcasts that I've done, you know that my specialties lie in mold toxicity, gut health, and we talk about hormonal health with fertility. And so we're going to talk about how this impacts the hormones, how this is going to impact the adrenals, and also how it's going to impact male fertility as well, which is really important to know. So the virus that we're talking about is obviously the one that has been going around for the past couple of years. And what we've seen in my clinical, presentations where people are coming to me or they'll be doing fantastic, and all of a sudden they get COVID, and then they're having this long haul thing where they're like, oh, I'm exhausted all the time. And the research is showing that you could be exhausted up to about a year after you've been exposed to COVID. And I'm not talking about the jab, I'm talking about actual exposure to the antigen, to the virus. Okay, so up to about a year. And then the study showed that I think it was 6 out of 91. It was like 7.4 million Americans, more or less, 7.4 million Americans, rough estimate, have this chronic fatigue state that was brought on due to COVID exposure. Okay. So what does that mean? How does that work? And that's where we're here to talk about here today. So there's different varying levels of research that has been done, and it is ever aggressively turning over, where we have one thing that's being said, that something else is coming out over here, and this, that, and the other thing. But I can tell you, cherry picking the research that matches what I see clinically in practice is what I'm basically going to be talking about today. Okay. Now, the big buzz thing is, does COVID cause infertility? Does it damage your hormones? So on and so forth, right? When we look at the hormones, the hormonal picture, the virus itself, yes, things with the spike protein, things like that it can do, absolutely. We're not talking about that today. What we're going to talk about is the impact and the stress on the actual adrenal glands themselves. Right. This is why a lot of us have this fatigue that it can set on, as soon as you get COVID, you're exhausted. You're like, man, I can't move out of the bed. And then again, up to about a year after exposure, you can still have chronic fatigue. So then what is that going to do to your hormones? But we have what's known as the pregnenolone steal or the cortisol steal. When our body is in a stress state, when it is in that fight or flight state, what it is trying to do is produce more cortisol. Cortisol gives us more energy. It flows all the blood out to the muscles and allows us to, either fight or run and flight. The opposite of that is going to be your rest and digest. Now, if we've been a year deep in fight or flight, that is not good for your health. We could talk about what the risk is in terms of cancer, because again, chronic sympathetic state has a tendency to increase your risk for solid tumor cancers. Okay, Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez talked about that. He's a medical doc, talked about the difference in nutrition and how you can stimulate the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic based off of what's going on. Okay. So there is a link, there is a correlation between cortisol and overall health. We know that cortisol also, again, prolonged exposure of cortisol is going to decrease immune function as well, because chronic stress is going to decrease your secretory IgA, which means you battled the virus, you battled the infection, but if you don't fix the adrenals afterwards, your secretory IgA or your immune system will still be weak post-exposure. So that means we can get it again. We can get these other strains. We can get new things that are coming out that my cousin unfortunately shared again on Instagram, and He's like, you ruined my day, buddy. Love you, Phil, but man, the data that you share is truthful and hurtful at the same time. Anyways, maybe that'll get me shadow banned right there, Phil. Anyway, so what is happening? What is going on here? What we are seeing is a lot of issues with fertility. We're seeing issues with being able to conceive as well as maintain pregnancies, healthy pregnancies during exposure of COVID or post-exposure of COVID. Like, well, what's going on here? Why? When we talk about the pregnenolone steal, pregnenolone flows into progesterone, progesterone flows into cortisol. If we're producing a ton of cortisol or we require a ton of cortisol, then we're going to be taking pregnenolone and progesterone and putting it into cortisol. You need progesterone in order to have a proper cycle, in order to get pregnant, and in order to have your best chance to hold full term. When we are stressed, what's happening is that pregnenolone steal is happening and you're just creating cortisol. You're not producing progesterone. Okay, you're producing it, but in lower amounts, lower concentrations. You can even go postmenopausal. We're seeing teenagers who are postmenopausal, post-exposure. A couple of docs, or one of the docs I work with, has shown me a 17-year-old just this week. And I was like, what in the world is going on? So we see that, and we see the HPA axis, and we're like, ooh, we need some work here. We need some work. So again, I've been cliffhangering you this entire time, but what is going on? A unique impact of the COVID virus, of this actual virus, is it produces a compound that's similar to what's known as ACTH, which is more or less the signal from your brain to tell your adrenal glands to produce your catecholamines, norepinephrine, epinephrine, aldosterone, those types of things, okay? Your cortisol, okay? It mimics ACTH. It is not your ACTH, so your body goes and attacks it. It produces antibodies. So we're almost having kind of an autoimmune type response that when our body naturally produces ACTH, those antibodies are coming after and attacking our own production. And then our adrenals are like, yo, we're stressed. Like, give me the signal. I know we got to do something here, but give me the signal so I can produce cortisol. And cortisol is plummeting. So when we're seeing on our cortisol awakening response panels, when we run like a Dutch Plus, we're seeing these blunted cortisol rhythms, okay? Within about 30 minutes after waking up, you're supposed to have at least a 50% increase from your cortisol readout between when you wake, 30 minutes after, and then 60 minutes after, it's supposed to come down again. If you connect the dots, it makes like this perfect little triangle. The range, I believe, is anywhere from 50% to 160% increase upon rising. What we're seeing is like 5%, or we've seen some that have gone negative. Like, what's happening? The HPA axis is broken in these cases. And then overall total cortisol production or metabolized cortisol, we're not producing the cortisol, or the cortisol that we do have is getting readily taken out of the body or deactivated to cortisone. So if you have any stage, and this is going into just overall health, when you have a suppressed adrenal response, or we have a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3 of adrenal exhaustion, adrenal fatigue, whatever you want to call it, you have a higher risk of contracting something like COVID. You have a worse rate of mortality, and you have a longer duration of symptoms associated with the disease, associated with the virus. Okay? That's going into getting the virus. Now, post getting the virus, this is where research is like, hey, this is still fresh. We don't really know. We're trying to figure out, we can fix it. I've fixed these rhythms before, just to like, not to doom and gloom you. Like, the protocols work to fix these things, but then in terms of your body's natural production, how long do we keep these antibodies for? How long do we attack our own ACTH production? Does it produce a new type of autoimmune disease? Is there a difference between naturally acquired COVID and then your synthetically manipulated COVID through a shot? What's the difference? What's that doing to our body? What's that doing to our immune system? And what's that going to do to our adrenals? When our adrenals go down, the rest of the body completely falls apart. All right. And this is one of the things with the research, where all the research I was going after, they're comparing male, female, ages, hormones, etc. But I'm like, you're comparing one piece of the human body, just one piece. You can't isolate just one piece of the human body and say, this is the problem. Each piece is delicately intertwined with each and every system of the body. Every organ, cell, and tissue of the body corresponds and talks to each other. Okay, if I stub my toe, that pain signal goes up to my brain. My brain's like, oof, threat, boom, heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, fight or flight goes up, cortisol goes up, catecholamines go up. All that stuff goes up, right? Everything is interconnected. So in reading this, you got to take it kind of with a grain of salt, where it's like, okay, we ran, cortisol patterns, we ran cortisol tests on these people, but we didn't do anything for the gut, right? This is where I'm like, come on, gut, guys, gut. Like I've seen a lot of digestive issues with patients post-COVID, whether it's their probiotics are wiped out. There's a couple probiotics in particular that can be completely gone. And then again, secretory IgA is going to be massively influenced through gut health. So if your gut is inflamed, or if you're stressed out and you're craving sugar, then you're going to have that microbial imbalance. You're going to have more bad guys growing than good guys. And so then that's going to have a play in and a role to play in your overall production, okay, or your overall symptoms or overall exposure. The other thing that they were finding in these studies is they're like, well, women have a tendency to get it more often, but have lesser symptoms associated with it. So they're finding a correlation to progesterone, actually, because women have naturally higher levels of progesterone than men do. Progesterone is a way to protect against COVID in women, which is pretty cool. But in menopause, they were finding that the rates were starting to match that of men. Like, what's changing? Well, the hormones are changing, progesterone's dropping, so therefore you have less progesterone, therefore you have a higher risk of infection. Now, you pair that with that pregnenolone steal or the cortisol steal, that's going to have that impact and drop your progesterone down, which is then going to leave you less protected, according to research, against these COVID viruses that are coming out. Okay? So again, adrenals. When it comes to the men, this is going to sound disgusting and it sucks. And I heard it, I'm like, man, you got to be kidding me, right? Our exposure, okay, they're like, okay, let's map the hormones. Let's talk about luteinizing hormone, because luteinizing hormone is a signal from the brain down to the Leydig cells, down in the testicles, the testes, and it tells them to produce testosterone. Luteinizing hormone is spiking in men with COVID infection, but testosterone levels are plummeting. So a lot of men are dealing with low T symptoms during COVID, which can then lead to fatigue, can lead to muscle loss, can lead to testicular issues, can lead to prostate issues. So the signal's coming down, but the testicles are like, hey, I have a reservoir, because this is apparently where COVID is hiding in men, is hiding in our testicles. Okay? So it's a nice storage pouch for COVID. Yay! Great design. Wink, wink. Right? What other better way to trigger infertility than go after the boys, right? And then M-spike proteins going after female reproductive. It's a brilliant virus, whoever found this virus. It's very, very brilliant how this thing works. Goes after the testes and shuts down production of testosterone. Now, there's going to be other fertility impacts with that, but the research is yet to come out to basically say, what are the parameters of that? What are the risks? What's the control group? What's the experimental group? The research is still super fresh, okay? And a lot of it's biased. So that's the other thing that makes it really difficult to pinpoint these things. But I think at the end of the day, we can really allow ourselves to admit, like, listen, this fertility thing is huge right now. It's huge. The rate of women who are coming to me with infertility or with miscarriages and all of these hormonal symptoms, or having their cycles where you have 2 weeks of a bleed fest, then you have 2 weeks off, then 2 weeks again, then 2 weeks off, then 2 weeks again, and 2 weeks off. They're like, what the hell is going on? Now we're starting to see some of the impact of what COVID has been doing to the hormones. Again, this is through natural acquisition of COVID and not jabbed COVID. Okay, jabbed COVID is a whole host of other things that I'm not going to talk about today. But we're talking about natural acquisition. So that's just breathing it in, getting it, and it deposits in our body, and we have to fight it. Okay? So when we see this as such, we have to understand that at the end of the day, okay, again, I've talked about this a billion times. I could not say this, but your adrenals are so important whenever it comes to overall health. Okay? I have a book that I talk about. It's a chronic stress crisis, I believe is what it's called. But it's somewhere down, and I have more books down there than what's on my shelf. Anyways, the chronic stress cycle, the chronic stress response is going to throw so many things off in the body, but we're seeing such a huge correlation with COVID. So if there were ever a time to take this seriously, this is the time. if you've had COVID, and this is a really short podcast because I want people to listen to it, but if you've had COVID and you're effing exhausted post-COVID, you should run yourself at least a salivary adrenal panel. Genova makes a great panel. They make a great one. That's the bare bones minimum. The optimum would be you run yourself a Dutch Plus test. So we see all the hormonal breakdown. And then we also see something from the stool, a GI map, see what the secretory IgA is doing. Then we smack those two together and we're like, what's going on? How are things functioning now? What was the impact pre? What was the impact post? Where do we need to go from there? Because ultimately, people are physiologically changing post-infection. We have to accept that. So we have to test that and see what is going on. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Not all men have low T post-infection. Not all women have fertility issues post-COVID infection, but we're seeing a huge correlation between these things. Remember, 7.4 million Americans are dealing with what I'm talking about here today, right now. So we have to get these things tested. We got to get that baseline done. The reason I love the Dutch test is because it's like the nerdiest of nerdy tests in the world. And I love that aspect. You get your adrenals, but you're also getting your progesterone. You're getting your estrogens. We're seeing what categories these things are breaking down, because a big factor that a lot of people aren't seeing, especially on the adrenal tests where it's just salivary adrenals, is I want to see something with 8-OHDG, which is an oxidative stress or DNA damage marker. Because what happens is due to stress, we can have hormonal suppression. Okay, women are dealing with decrease in progesterone, decrease in estrogen post-exposure to COVID, going post-menopausal. But these hormones where your estrogens break down, you're going down the 4-OH pathway. It's a toxic pathway. It's a bad pathway. And then that goes down into the 8-OHDG, which is a cancer-causing. Both of them are cancer-causing pathways. They're not good. The Dutch test is the only test that I've come across that shows that. So again, if this is something that you're interested or scared of or whatever, and you're just like, I just want to know, please reach out so you can get tested. So that way, just in case some other wave of this stuff comes, you already have a competitive advantage with your adrenals already being way better and way stronger than where they were before. Okay. Again, research has not come out yet to say how long the negative impact on your ACTH is or how long it's going to be, but we know it's there, so we have to recognize it. Okay. So with that being said, it'll leave you with a cliffhanger that if you want more on this information, find me on Instagram, shoot me a message, be like, hey, Doc, I listened to your podcast. Can you dive in a little bit deeper on this, that, or the other thing? I would strongly recommend, if you listen to this, you're like, what is all of this LH and the adrenal glands? What's an HPA axis? I did a podcast on that. Go back to one of the previous episodes and you'll see how I talk about the HPA axis. So that way you can learn more about how this impacts your health. So thanks for tuning in as usual today. I love you all and I hope you have a great day.